Once again, welcome everyone. Today we're going to have Adnan talk about Azure security. So this is going to be an interesting session about Azure. So we are already in the clouds, but everyone's at home. So when everyone is saying move to the cloud, everyone move to the home, which is very strange, the other way around. But at least our computers all went to the clouds, and we're going to have Adnan talk about clouds. As usual, we don't have any food in this time, so we don't have a food break. But just as we did before we started the session, we're gonna when we finish the session at the end, we'll still stick around for a few minutes to talk between each other, and that should be okay. But remember, as we always say, there is a free barbecue, but it's in each other's houses. Okay. Next up, we have Adnan. So no more slides for me. Adnan, you're up. Do your magic.
Let's get started. So once again, thank you for inviting me for the user group. A lot of my buddies are in Portugal, in Lisbon and surrounding, big part of the community. And it's always nice to be invited, especially when we have the live events. My session for this evening, or the virtual barbecue edition, as per request, is all about securing your Azure estate or your Azure environment, workloads running in Azure. But my focus will be on networking, because I believe that networking is pretty much one of the core, components of any data center, and networking is extremely important. So the main focus will be on the different security aspects that networking can provide for just about your whole application landscape or all your resources in Azure. Now, everybody can follow me on Twitter at microspecialist. In my profile, you'll see the user group information and all the other crazy stuff I do. So follow me on Twitter, where I share my information. A little bit more about me. So I'm like Simba, born in Africa, raised in Cape Town, but living in the Netherlands. I pretty much work all over the world. This is a slide that Andre asked me. I pretty much do everything. I'm a one-man show, but I gave myself the creative director position since there was nobody else to do it, just me. Famous quotes, always good, and that's my personal quote when people ask me how you're doing, because I always feel like I'm doing good, right? I'm South African. And my technical famous quote is Microsoft has a habit of always changing the rules. And I'm sure, like me, you guys will be invited to companies, and you have to explain some part of technology, and they're always trying to find what the best practice is, or what specific rules are to implement a piece of software. And right now we're dealing with cloud environments. So quite often, a lot of my clients, and I'm sure some of yours, they're still tied into some of the ethics or rules and constraints that we used to deal with in the past. But we know that things change. So quite often, a lot of difficulties in my job is explaining to people that those rules don't apply anymore, because we're dealing with new set of rules. Some of my hobbies, I'm sure some of you know. I've seen you in certain places all over the world. So it used to be traveling. I've been stuck home just like most people. And I used to travel for food, not just work, like a vacation. My other hobby is eating, preferably meat. In South Africa, we say braai. It's our word for barbecue or churrasco, I believe. Working out in my home gym, which is upstairs due to all the eating, so I can stay in shape. And I've got a thing for Nike Air Jordan shoes, which I sometimes resell, and like to get those kind of stuff, as you can see behind me. So once again, thank you for all the sponsors that make these kind of events possible. As a guy that organizes events, we understand how difficult it is, and without sponsors and people to help, So please make sure if you're in Portugal, make use of these guys' services. So let's begin. So like security and cloud environments, pretty much like the work that you're going to be doing or your implementation of your projects, it's like a barbecue, right? You want to control the environment that you work in, efficiently stack things the way you want them to be, and carefully prepare and plan controlling the environment. And like making a fire, so you want to do it safely. So in the end, you get a good result, or you get the right desired outcome. In this example, it's a nice juicy piece of picana with a crunchy fatty layer and a medium rare meat side. So with enough planning, you generally get a good result, but sometimes things don't often go the way you want them to be. So this could be when looking at Azure, things like you haven't implemented some piece of security that could result in a data breach or some sort of security risk. But in the end, the desired result, just to show you a nice rosy center, since it is a virtual barbecue. And by repeating certain processes, after you get the hang of it, you get the same result, So with my barbecues, I'm very precise as well. I like to gauge the temperature of the meat. So it's no guesswork. It's quite easy. And, I tell people they just have to check the temperature. Once you hit 50 degrees Celsius, you're pretty much ready to sear for another 5. So my perfect sweet spot is between 52 and 53. So in between 50 and 55 degrees Celsius. But my key takeaways or agenda for my session today is to kind of help you guys look at moving towards a zero trust networking model and show that you can segment your network, create microparameters, utilize things like Azure firewalls, NSG, network security groups, etc. Try and utilize cloud native services so you can have an in-depth security strategy that just makes your overall environment that much safer. And things like web application firewall, DDoS protection for your applications, how and where you can get assistance in doing that, and even look at exploring Azure and using that as your internet edge with Azure Firewall Manager. So instead of allowing internet or network communication directly to your network from outside, you can route it through Azure and have all those secure services, preventing any breaches and decreasing your risk. I like to show this slide, this high-level overview with all the different Azure services, because you can see that the structure of the infrastructure. Under the EOS part, you have networking, and networking is quite broad. So like I was saying, Azure is this enormous cloud ecosystem. There's a lot of services, and pretty much everything ties down into storage, networking, and all the other services, right? So networking is kind of like the glue that connects everything else. So it's pretty much my focus. And as you can see, things like virtual networks, your express routes, VPN gateways, all the connecting services running there. So focusing on Azure network security, there's actually like a lot of native services involved. You can segment your traffic into different locations or portions. And the nice thing is in Azure, everything is software defined. So they don't have to connect to anything if you don't want them to be. They could be like islands and independent. So by segmentation, you prevent the lateral movement of and data exfiltration of resources and access. You also can protect your network with things like threat intelligence. That's most of the time built in. You just have to enable it for a particular service. And things like the distributed connectivity. So being in Azure, pretty much all Microsoft services can be connected. Things like your PAR services as well. And by utilizing DevOps, you could securely deploy everything in Azure, maybe even in your own data center if you're using Azure Stack and those kind of stuff. So when looking at the overall picture of cloud native network security services, and just built on top of the software-defined network portion of Azure Networks, you have security services like Azure Firewall. So you can put in a firewall both for your network and also your web application. So depending on the type of firewall, really just does different checks on different policies. You have Azure Private Link, which is something that I'll go into more detail later on in my session, and that allows you to connect securely to Azure services. And then there's the Azure DDoS protection, and that's something that you definitely want if you're going to have a website running in Azure. Now, with that in mind, a lot of things are kind of provided through Azure or Microsoft, but there's a lot of third-party services and appliances in the marketplace. For example, from F5, Fortinet, Citrix, Cisco, etc., that you can just go and pull from the marketplace and implement in your environment. And quite often, sometimes you already license for that if you're running certain software on premises. So focusing on the network segmentation, you could pretty much segment on different levels. Now, a lot of clients have different subscriptions for different environment pieces or resources that they segment for quite often cost or cost involvement per resource within the company. Technically, everything can still work and connect to one another, even though they're in different subscriptions. And then you have your virtual networks that you can go and create. You can create different virtual networks for each use case or workloads, depending on what you need them for. For example, you might have a virtual network that runs your company's resources, but you might want to have an application hosted in its own virtual network, and you can either have it connected to the rest of your virtual networks through VNet peering, or the nice thing is, if it doesn't need to be connected to anything, you just leave it as is and make sure that it runs. And then depending on if you need to connect to it through VPN or a public IP, depends on how you will utilize that. So the thing that we use to secure and filter the network communication or traffic between virtual networks or within virtual networks is by use of network security groups. So it's where you really just allow deny specific traffic within your VNet or into your VNet or your virtual machine. So with the web application firewalls, on the application level to protect your web workloads and creating policies for your network, utilizing threat intelligence, things like filtering botnet communication that you can do, and any other threat intelligence steps that I'll show you guys in a bit. So with VNet peering, it's pretty much where you can connect different VNets together. For example, in my diagram here, VNet A is paired through my hub VNet, with VNet B is also paired with my hub VNet. And in my hub VNet, I have a gateway subnet that's connected to on-premises. So by utilizing the gateway subnet of the hub VNet, VNet A and VNet B can kind of get to on-premises, and on-premises can get to the different VNets A and B. The nice thing with software-defined networking is that we can also define specific routing to also filter traffic and make sure that the right traffic goes to the right network and pretty much customize it the way we want it to be. So by filtering traffic, utilizing network security groups. So for example, in my previous slide with VNet A and VNet B and the hub VNet, much like my diagram now with the NSG1 and NSG2, different virtual machines, I can filter the kind of traffic that's accepted on that subnet or even that's allowed at the virtual machine's network interface. So if I have, for example, a web server, I want to make sure that maybe web traffic is allowed. And for example, I might have a database and I want to make sure that only data traffic is allowed. So all other traffic is either denied, or I can filter my traffic in a way, and generally you will place specific web servers in their own subnet, for example, front-end subnets and back-end subnets, and then just filter the traffic using network security groups. And that's one of the ways you can use multi-tier application architectures hosted in Azure by creating network security groups. On the other side, you can also create application security groups that's based on the type of application that's hosted on virtual machines. So there's quite a lot of virtual appliances that you could utilize from the marketplace. Things like Citrix application delivery controller, things for WAN optimization, first and third party appliances. So a lot of these things work sometimes better than the Microsoft products, or they do more intrinsic checks. Remember that the kind of service or product that you are placing within Azure on the Microsoft side, they always sell different sizes. You got the basic, standard, and premium. So if it's basic, it's pretty much just there for you to play around with. For production workloads, you're going to take standard, and within standard, you still have varying degrees. So that's very important to look at, because quite often the one you want is the most expensive option, which is a premium SKU, because it has all the benefits and the checks that you require. So that's one of the things that you sometimes need to really have a look at. The same thing with the different appliances that are involved and available in Azure, but have a look at some of them. So in my demo environment that I pretty much have set up, well, this is like a sample of an environment to show how you can go and split up your virtual network into different subnets. And one of the things that we quite often do is we have a connection between our on-premises network or your company's data center, and you either have an express route set up or a VPN set up to a gateway subnet. And depending on, obviously, an express route is very expensive, but it does give some better features and functionality, and you'd pretty much only use it because you want the bandwidth and it's a private connection to Azure. And that's something that quite a lot of people want. A lot of people don't like to go over internet. It's something that we do. And the same thing in saying that when you're running virtual machines in your different subnets, I've seen lousy implementations where pretty much half of the virtual machines, they also have public IP addresses. Now that's, a lot of risk right there, because a lot of companies do port scanning, and that's like quite vulnerable on the internet. So sometimes they'll have firewalls. It's one of the things that you can implement to create safety through going through internet and your public IP addresses, or, you could put a firewall in between your gateway subnet and the rest of your subnets in your Azure virtual network. Now, one of the nice things that's available is Azure Bastion Host. It's a kind of managed service, because I know a lot of us used to implement jump boxes. So you pretty much deployed a VM that had public IP, but even that wasn't safe enough, and it cost a lot of money because you got to stick a firewall and a lot of security products or appliances in front of that. And I've seen bad software that people utilize for jump hosts, and some are even on international company projects that I've worked on, where you can pretty much see the previous administrator's username and password, so it was really crappy software. But I think Microsoft's really created a nice thing with Azure Bastion Host, which is like a secure way of connecting to your virtual machines, and it's all managed by them. So with my first demo, it's one of the slides that I'm utilizing from the slide deck. So I just want to go to my Azure subscription right here. And quite often, I just want to go to virtual networks. And by jumping into the virtual network, I just want to show you that there's different subnets connected. So it's split up into front-end subnet, the back-end, there's a gateway subnet as well, and also a subnet for my Azure Bastion host. So your Bastion host is something that is pretty much utilizing that subnet for the IP addresses so that they connect within the VNet. So you could connect to one of my virtual machines. So if I go to my virtual machines, I've got 2 running right now. So server 1 and server 2, you can see on my essentials pane. And this is something that I always show. You can only see its essentials if you minimize it, and then you can see that it's essentials. But if I maximize that essential pane, you can see there's no public IP address for this virtual machine. So there's no way anybody can get to it or do some port scanning to that machine. It only has a private IP address. And in my scenario, my whole entire virtual network is running solely on Azure. I don't have any connection to an on-premises environment through VPN or ExpressRoute. So the only way I can either connect to it is through that private IP address. So by going to my settings blade under operations, I have Bastion. Firstly, let me just show you what happens if I try to connect to it through RDP. I won't be able to get to it, you see, because it's a private IP address. So from my client machine through the RDP profile or connection, I won't be able to connect to it. But if I go to Bastion, I get the same thing if I click on Bastion. I have the ability to go through the Azure Bastion service, which is a managed service. So Microsoft pretty much has a virtual machine scale set running in the backend that they manage, that's provided to me through the browser. And I can log in by utilizing my username. And this is where everybody sees my long password, which is ... And I can make a secure connection through my browser and get access to my server. And so entirely through that private IP address. So no public IP address. That's much safer. My managed service is protected by Microsoft. So it's only open for my virtual machines running in that virtual network under my subscription. So nobody else can get there. So now I can do whatever I need to do, and I just need to sign out, not shut down, because I know a lot of people do that mistake. So I can disconnect, and I'm back in my Azure portal. So quite safe, running through an HTTP connection. So that's one of the main things that I find is that the less public IPs you have in Azure, the better. And later on, when I show you guys how Azure Private Link works, it's really one of the features that a lot of my clients surely have been, waiting on, because the last thing clients like to do, and especially when I have to tell them, like, a few years ago when people utilize PaaS services from Azure, or even a lot of Microsoft services, companies hate opening up their firewalls and placing in all those IP addresses. It's always a fight which IPs they need to put in place, and quite often they just want to know what the entire block range is. But that's also like a risk, because then you're just opening up quite a large range, and most companies don't like that. So I'm just gonna exit back and go back to the presentation. So I just showed you how the Azure Bastion works, and it's pretty easy to set up. You basically just add it as a service, and you have to specify Azure Bastion subnet. The funny thing is you have to call it Azure Bastion subnet. And the thing is you only get about 27 IP addresses really. Well, 22 in use. So that just means that max 22 connections if you utilize all the IP addresses. So it allows secure, seamless RDP or SSH, depending on if you're running Windows or Linux, through your SSL connection over internet, which is generally 443 or HTTP, HTTPS, and through the Bastion host, all the virtual machines can be made available through that service. And it really supports everything. It's agentless. The only thing is it doesn't work in conjunction with just-in-time virtual machine access. And just-in-time virtual machine access is something that we could do to only open up that RDP port on a specific virtual machine for a certain amount of time whenever we needed that through Security Center. So that's so we still, for some clients where they have to do it directly through a public IP, we utilize just in time. And that's pretty much that you have to do if you can't go through Azure Bastion or a more secure option. So moving on further with my session, you actually have to look at the different layers. So even on the application layer, your workload, and depending on the type of infrastructure that you will be supporting, whether it's a PaaS service or it is infrastructure as a service, for both your public IP addresses, your private IP, you can segment your traffic on different layers. So on the application layer, also creating application aware segmentation with application firewalls, application security groups, and that's if your infrastructure is moving towards more application-centric management, because a lot of clients are, they're a bit tired looking at virtual machines. They're running an application, and the application consists of a number of virtual machines, some database servers or PaaS services, and that's an application to them, so you basically have to look at the entire application resources as one application. Sometimes to some clients, the whole network, they like to think of that way. But my idea more here is that you're going to look at application layer, infrastructure, and just segment it in a way so you can do filtering, fault tolerance between the different layers, and also those visibility things with if you're doing API-driven DevOps or some sort of security through things like Security Center, or how you're peering your network, and also the routing that you're doing. So sometimes I've been with clients where they routing things through a specific region, even though it's maybe hosted somewhere, but because the main branch office is running somewhere, they're utilizing that region's resources and still running workloads in other regions. So that's one of the things that things like Azure Firewall Manager also helps in, where you could centralize your network security policies and routing management for globally distributed systems or companies that's pretty much spread out across the globe. So depending on the services that they want to manage, so sometimes you only have Azure regional web application firewalls, or you have centralized firewall. So you could pretty much create a secure hub environment, connect all your virtual networks. We can have automated routing and having a centralized location to just define, because quite often companies they're running the same servers in different locations that require the same management, the same policies, SQL protocols, web protocols, etc. And they can just apply it to different regions, the same policies, just applied on different systems. So even things with advanced security, with third-party services, and combined with Azure Firewall for any private traffic and those kind of things. So with Azure Web Application Firewall, you can create web application firewall policies that you can, depending on the type of application firewall, whether it's a global one for your entire infrastructure or all your services, or if you implementing them regionally as an application gateway. In the end, it's protecting all the services basically that's available on Azure, whether it's PaaS, infrastructure as a service, and also the latest trend. And I'm not sure if you guys feel the same way, but everybody's just throwing Kubernetes around, and I'm hearing great stuff, and I can't share the great stuff, but a lot of companies are looking at investing that into their normal products. So it's really, really cool stuff coming. Even serverless, your on-premises backend can be secured by your application gateway running in your firewall running in Azure. So, depending on if you're using geo-filtering or regional. And one of the most important things I always tell people, because quite often when people create certain websites, virtual networks, or things in Azure, they see that it says basic DDoS protection is already added. And the thing is, I have to explain to people that basic doesn't cover you. The basic covers Microsoft. You actually need the extended protection, so you have to take the standard or extra DDoS protection, but it really does cloud scale DDoS protection for the entire Azure resources that you have from public internet. So it utilizes things like adaptive tuning, looking at the type of traffic, with different kinds of metrics and analytics that it kind of utilizes. So Microsoft runs their own machine learning adaptive tuning engine that can check the incoming request, which public IP is being accessed, and these things are guaranteed by SLA and those kind of things. So you could do DDoS in front of your firewalls and protecting the web applications behind those. So it's just extra protection, so you don't have to experience a blackout on your websites or have some intermittent interruptions. So with Azure Network Connectivity, there's different ways that you can transform your network approach, right? So the thing with looking at it from a application point of view, most companies are creating workloads where it's no longer about just working with computers. You know, it's basically running an application and making sure that the user to app, depending on the type of application. So if it's a server application or data center application, that it's really connected to a server-centric type of connectivity. So you want the backend connections to Azure services that shouldn't really go over internet. You know, if an endpoint or a client accesses internet for a website or PaaS service or Office 365 or those kind of things, then it's okay. You know, so quite often companies have, and you know, as bad as this whole COVID-19 pandemic situation is, it has driven a lot of change, and it has shown people, especially now with a lot of workers working from home and everywhere else besides the office, that internet connectivity, you know, you don't require all your clients to connect to your branch office. If they need something from internet, they can just go over their own internet connection. So they don't have to send traffic to the office, you know. So a lot of companies are experiencing those kind of networking, epiphanies where they realize they need to redesign the entire network and the security models as they move from, user and application centric connectivity. So this is one of the things that, you know, I like to go into conversation with people about, and just look at where you can place your network security edge. Like in Azure, you could, depending on the traffic that your users need, so they're going directly to Azure, and whatever needs to go through the branch office, it can. Or if it's from a server, that server doesn't need to go through internet. It can just privately connect to a service in an Azure workload. So you could utilize Azure as your virtual WAN. For example, set up your different regions and branch offices to connect either via ExpressRoute or VPN, etc., to in a hub or any-to-any connectivity where Azure functions as your virtual network or wide area network and firewall integration. So looking at Azure Firewall Manager, which is a new preview service, it not only allows you to centralize things like your firewall policies across different Azure firewalls, but it also allows you to extend your secure edge or security edge to Azure by creating a secure hub environment. So virtual hubs, kind of like a DMZ hub in Azure. You can create either global or local policies depending on the type of environment that you have. You'd be able to do split routing for things like Office 365 and things like public PaaS services that being provided. So depending on how you will be connecting to those services through the secure hub. So there's a number of partners as well that's integrated with Azure Firewall Manager, things Zscaler, iBoss. I'm not sure if Checkpoint's already available. You know, these things happen so fast. So quite often, a lot of these things are either already working, but you know the website is not supporting it yet. So keep a lookout on that. And that brings me to my next demo. My next demo, I'd like to show you Azure private link service. It's a way you can securely connect to Azure PaaS services, but through a private connection. Now, the past couple of years, a lot of clients, they loved Azure, but one of the things that pained them was that the PaaS services, they were available through internet. So quite often on their, firewalls, they need to have the public IPs of Azure that Microsoft has for the PaaS services and all the Azure DNS names. And think of it, right? Where do you store your stuff? Or where did we store stuff and run things from? Storage accounts. One of the things with a storage account, the name needs to be unique. And the reason for that is it can be, or it used to be, only publicly available. So with public internet, so that DNS name had to be unique across the entire world. Not, you could say Azure, but if it's on Azure, it's the world. So it's available worldwide, and things like SQL databases. So a lot of these PaaS services were great to use, but companies didn't like going through public internet. So Microsoft came with a solution by creating Azure Private Link. And I've already set up a private link. So if you go to a private link center, so you could either set up or create a private connection to a specific service, and this could be a PaaS service like Azure Storage Account or Cosmos DB or SQL, Azure SQL. So instead of having your virtual network, virtual machine, because quite often your front end was running on a virtual machine and your database was, if you didn't have it in a virtual machine, we all preach to companies to put it on PaaS as SQL. It's better, it's cheaper. And the thing is that backend virtual machine running securely in your data center or in Azure, it went through public internet, so a lot of latency, a lot of connection. And now with Private Link, we can use Microsoft's own backbone, own network infrastructure. We don't have to leave Azure actually, and we can go and create private endpoints. So I've created a private endpoint already that's only connected to a specific resource. So my resource is SQL Server. I've connected a resource to Corp DB SQL Server database, and that's my private endpoint to that Azure SQL database. So instead of, wherever I connect this corporate link endpoint to, so it's connected to my corporate virtual network in my backend subnet. So it's got a private IP address from that subnet, and any of my virtual machines or resources running in my virtual network only have to go to that private IP address or this private endpoint to connect to my Azure SQL. So it's a secure connection. No communication is going out to internet. And so I don't have any connections at the moment. So I've got another virtual machine running here. And just to show you, there's my database. There's my database, and I don't have to set any server firewalls or anything. It's already connected. I just go to my virtual machine. This specific server that I'm running, it's got a public IP address because I want to connect through RDP. All right, where is that? Yeah, there we go. So the password is still the same. Yes, do a connection. And now I just need to move it across so you guys can see. So this virtual machine, I'm running SQL Server Management Studio. Now, even though my Azure SQL database is running as a PaaS service, nobody can get to it except these virtual machines, these two virtual machines running in my virtual network. Let me just remember the password, which is pretty much the same. And I'm really just putting in the Azure database DNS name. And I connect, and it connects, and I can work and access my my database and do my work. And this could be, you know, my front-end application, for example, running over here. So I'm just gonna disconnect that. So even if I try to go back to my SQL database, if I go to the server, so connection to the server, under security, you can see that I have the private endpoint connections listed, and it has the approved private endpoint connection. So when it comes to firewalls, my client IP address or my public IP address, I won't even be able to connect to this database through my internet connection. For example, if I go yeah, on the connection. So you could do the same thing for things like storage accounts, for example, you know, because it's the same thing. So if I go to storage account, you could also set it up with a private endpoint connection. So no access through internet. So this one is not connected, and at the same time, I can go and add it to a new private connection if I create one. But I'm not going to do that, otherwise my application doesn't work. So you guys will just have to believe that it also works with storage accounts the same way that it works with Azure SQL. So one of the things, you know, Azure changes quite often. I just wanted to show you that if you don't know about the Azure heat map, you can Google Azure heat map or just go to azurecharts.com. You can pretty much see in a nice overview all the different services and when the last time anything was updated in there. So it's something that I pretty much always have open, especially when you're doing sessions as well, because it's kind of difficult to tell people things like size limits and things like that because they change quite often. And also things like preview services, which services are generally available. So this is really handy to go and look at and see over here. So things like, you know, networking, all updates, etc. And so just have a look at them and check it out. So I'm just going back to my session. So this is the high-level overview of Azure Private Link. So it basically allows you to create a private endpoint that's an IP address in your subnet, in your virtual network, and you use that to connect to your public PaaS services. So you can have your own services, you can create a private link service, so you can have, you can even host PaaS services or a private endpoint for your own clients. So it's private access and virtual network, even through peered networks or on premises through express route. And quite often, especially for your clients that are, allergic to adding new public IPs on their firewalls, they love this. So this is one of those things that, that's really going to bump up the Azure credits that companies are using. And it's got built-in data exfiltration protection. So you could even set that specific, accounts and the type of access that's allowed. It's a predictable private IP address. So it's in your own virtual net. So you could have your own custom internal DNS if you're running from on-premise, etc. And access all those sparse resources through Microsoft's network. So unified, it doesn't really matter if it's marketplace, customer owned, your own environment or service. So just to quickly show a overall view of how it all kind of fits in place. You got your public pass that you will secure your services through things like private link or private pass. You have your global firewall that you can secure all your other firewalls and regional firewalls, Azure DDoS protection, firewalls for your on-premises or branch offices, depending on how you segment your network traffic. On the network side, you have your network security groups that you can go and segment different network, filter the IP traffic, so every section of your workload. So now, even though it's a PaaS service, you're still going to be using networking, so just because Microsoft is managing it for you, that it's running as a service, you can access it now through a private network or private IP address, a private link. So that's actually one of the best things that's available right now. So going back to the key takeaways. So quite a lot of options and possibilities for everybody. And the main thing is the more control you have, the better your outcome. So that's you can see my point thermometer in my piece of Côte de Boeuf. That's nicely at 50 degrees Celsius, 0.4. And just utilize the, or look at the different services that's available and utilize the ones that you require. Quite often you're going to want to use something that you might have already if you're utilizing network appliances on premises, like Kemp or Barracuda or F5, Cisco or Citrix even, and look at the offers in the marketplace and the differences. Sometimes, depends on the version. So you always have to test. So look at the native services, but also look at the different marketplace items. And definitely, if you're running a web application, API, mobile app, DDoS is just one of those things that I think everybody needs, not just port protection or ports scanning for, the threats. So one of the nice things, especially if you're new to Azure Web Firewall, let me just quickly show you, if I may. Go back to my Azure portal. So especially for web apps. So one of the nice things that the Azure Web Application has is that you can create custom rules. You can set up to prevention or only detection. But one of the managed rules, you really just have to select the items. And this is quite handy to see. Basically, depending on the type of managed rule set, for example, I've enabled Microsoft Bot Manager rule set and OWASP 3.0, and it does a number of different checks. For example, it does protocol attacks, application, PHP, SQL injection, session hijacking, a lot of these different checks. And all you got to do is pretty much just select it. So a lot of these things have, for example, known bad bots that can be enabled, protecting your application from bots. And you can also create custom rules and things that you can just go and specify the source location backend and either allow or deny or log traffic. So there's quite a lot of items that you can go and utilize in different firewalls. So I just thought I'd show you guys that quickly. And with that said, once again, thanks for these great sponsors. So make sure that you have a look and utilize them. And the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Micro Specialist, find me online. Just went back so quickly. And obrigado. One more thing, my email address, if you can find me on LinkedIn, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram with Microspecialist. It's also my email address, so microspecialist@hotmail.com. Send me an email if there's any questions. You guys will get this slide deck or recording sometime in whenever. And then if anything's not clear, just hit me up through any DM or email.